could have got more out. I could have got more. I don't know if I just... I could have got more.
Oskar, there are 1,100 people who are alive because of you. Look at them.
Hello and welcome to the Booker Prize podcast with me, James Walton.
Me, Jo Hamier. And today we launch a new mini-series called The Booker at the Oscars, cunningly timed to run between the recently announced Oscar nominations for this year and the Oscar ceremony. We'll be looking at 3 Booker novels and the films made out of them that went on to Oscar glory. Or in one case, The Remains of the Day very nearly did, given that it was nominated for 8 awards in 1994, but didn't actually win any, mainly because of the Booker novel that dominated the Academy Awards that year and is our subject this week.
And people who like Booker quizzes, and let's face it, who doesn't, will also know that this was the first ever Booker-winning novel to become a movie that won the Best Picture Oscar. And it won several more besides, because it's, altogether quizzes, Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, as adapted from Thomas Keneally's Schindler's Ark. And for a bonus point for those quizzes, this was Spielberg's second adaptation of a Booker novel after Empire of the Sun, that was the hot favourite in 1984, lost out to Hotel du Lac by Anita Bruckner. But just before we get on to that, I can't resist proudly noting in passing that there's a Booker link to the Oscars this year too, although maybe a slightly more tenuous one. American fiction, nominated in 5 categories, including Best Picture, is based on Percival Everett's novel Erasure, a favourite book of Joe's, as regular listeners will know, and Everett was shortlisted in 2022 for The Trees. That counts as a Booker connection, doesn't it, Jo?
Yes, it does. I'm more concerned with the fact that it just prompts everyone to read Erasure. Everyone should read Erasure. Anyway, let's get on to where Spielberg's triumph all began. Schindler's Ark, the novel, with Schindler's List, the film, to follow in part 2 of today's podcast. So, James, what can you tell me about Schindler's Ark author Thomas Keneally?
I can tell you that he was born in 1935 to 2 Irish Australians, grew up in Kempsey, a small town in New South Wales, and then Homebush, a suburb of Sydney. And then, rather importantly in his life, age 17, he went off to a seminary to become a Catholic priest, which he almost did, staying in the seminary for 6 years and leaving only just before he was due to be ordained. Apparently, he had a loss of faith, a fairly solid reason for leaving, I suppose, caused by the sheer unkindness of the church leaders that he was surrounded with. But this resulted in something of a breakdown, and he entered the 1960s feeling, quote, pretty lost. So he moved back in with his parents, did some teaching in a part-time law course, but then, Jo, came 2 big breaks. First, he had a novel accepted for publication, The Place at Whitton, based on his seminary experiences. Second, his mum gave it to her night nurse to read, and the nurse loved it, asked to meet the author, and married him a year later.
Aww.
And Keneally and Judy, herself a former nun, have been married ever since. Meanwhile, the books have kept coming at a fair old speed. Now written more than 40 novels, more than 20 works of non-fiction, mainly on Australian history, 5 plays and 3 screenplays. As for his Booker form, which obviously we're obsessed by on this podcast, he was shortlisted 3 times for The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, Gossip from the Forest, and Confederates, before winning with Schindler's Ark in 1982, published in America as Schindler's List, hence the name of the film. Incidentally, the ever-modest Keneally thinks that An Ice Cream War by William Boyd should have won that year, as in fact did the chair of judges, Professor John Carey. Anyway, on a happier note, one of Keneally's later books that I particularly commend to our listeners is a book called The Daughters of Mars from 2012. Unbelievably powerful novel about 2 Australian nurses in the First World War, which also tackles the great Australian founding myth of Gallipoli. And so all in all, it's no wonder that Keneally was made a national living treasure in Australia, where that's an official thing. Appointments made by the Australian National Trust. Other national living treasures, some of them are dead now, but anyway, they were national living treasures when they weren't, include Russell Crowe, Kathy Freeman, Nicole Kidman, and of course, Kylie Minogue. We both interviewed Thomas Keneally, haven't we, in our time?
Yeah.
The world's most genial man, do you think?
Yeah. Wait, was your interview in person?
Yeah.
See, you've got one up on me because all of my communication with him was either over Zoom or email.
Yes, in post-COVID days. No, I met him. And he's the only author I've ever interviewed who showed me the pictures of his grandchildren.
Yeah.
And he was also talking about how basically he wanted to be a writer to impress the Poms, he kept saying. So he said at one point, if I could have scored 150 before tea at Lord's, that would have been better. But you do what you can. Was he just as genial over Zoom?
He was so lovely. I mean, we emailed for just under a year and had a handful of Zoom calls because I interviewed him for the Booker Prize. You can find the interview on our YouTube channel and on the Booker Prize website. I'm sure I meant to say that somewhere in here.
Well done, Joe.
But yeah, no, he's so generous with his conversation, but you can pretty much talk to him about anything, and like he'll go on at length, but not in a boring way at all. But I think one of the best kind of conversations I remember with him, and something that he talks about a lot, and not special by any means, is just his feelings about the Australian Aboriginal community.
Yeah.
And I think he describes himself as a kind of Euro-Australian or like empire-adjacent Australian. And he's very, very firm in his kind of anti-empire, anti-colonialist kind of stance. And it's just really fascinating to hear him. It's never that he talks to you with a particularly moral stance. It's just he's so clear in himself where he stands, and he kind of opens himself out to you for you to respond to that. I found that really beautiful in him and quite pertinent for the book that we're discussing today.
I think it was a leader of still is probably, of the Republican movement in basically getting rid of her. His Majesty, can you believe, in Australia. And there's a traditional fault line, isn't there, in Australian society between Irish descendants of the Irish, who are essentially descendants of convicts, and descendants of the English, who are essentially descendants of warders. And he's very much on the Irish side of that. And of course, one of the stories that he is invited to tell in every interview, and I think we both probably did ask him to do it as well, is the origin story of his most famous book, Schindler's Ark. So let's hear him telling it to you, I believe, Joe. Just to set it up, he's flying back to Australia and changes planes in LA. His briefcase breaks, and he happens to go into a shop to get it replaced. Here we go.
I went to buy a briefcase. As I looked in a bag shop called the Handbag Studio, a burly man of middle age emerged, and he said, so it's 105 degrees out here and you won't come in to my air-conditioned store? Are you scared of me? This man turned out to be a survivor amongst the Schindler Juden. I entered, and the store, the owner of the store, Leopold Pfefferberg, said, what are you doing in Beverly Hills? I told him I was staying round the corner, that I'd been doing been to a film festival, doing a bit of book promotion. He began to tell me then, soon after, that he was a Holocaust survivor. He first asked me, did I know certain people in Sydney? So I didn't know his Jewish friends, and he said they and I were rescued by a Nazi. But although he was a Nazi, he saved us, so to me, he's Jesus Christ. But a saint, he wasn't. And then the story began.
At that point in the interview, I can remember Tom telling me that Poldark had taken him to a filing cabinet that was essentially full of like World War II. I don't know if memorabilia is the right word, because it was full of sort of like SS cables and
all relating
letters.
to Schindler.
Yeah, all relating to Schindler. And then most famously, the list itself, Oskar Schindler's list of Jews to be saved.
The story has been a little bit embellished over the years because one thing he told me when he told me that story, which I did like, is that Pfefferberg said to him, what you making conversation, and said to him, what do you do? And he says, I'm a novelist. And he says, I've got a story for you. At which point Thomas Keneally's heart completely sinks, because that's what people always say. And then Pfefferberg tells him all about Schindler, and he realises he's got the plot for by far his greatest book. Yes, opinion seems to be divided as to whether actually Schindler's List was in that book, in that safe, though he did tell me it was. What's quite interesting is it's on Wikipedia and it's got a footnote, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, so maybe it was there after all. Look at the footnote and it says interview with James Walton. So certainly that's the basics. He gets all the documentation, all the evidence, and the perfect plot that he needs. This guy who was not, saintly, but who did save all these people.
Well, I think this intermingling of fact and potential embellishment is perfect for the book we're about to discuss. It was, of course, a massive point of contention whether Schindler's Ark, the novel, was actually a novel at all, whether it qualified for the Booker Prize, although I think that there's really no question about it. But still, this idea of sort of embellishing upon fact is central to the book.
Just in case there's anybody there who doesn't know, or maybe just knows the film, and not that they're massively different, they are different in some ways. Can you just give us a quick summary of the book?
Well, the book partially revolves around this character of Oskar Schindler, who is, many ways to describe him, actually an entrepreneur, a womanizer, a bon vivant, but crucially a member of the German Nazi Party by 1939, who installs himself in Krakow and sees the rise of the Nazi regime as an opportunity to make money. In Krakow, he decides to take over a bankrupt enamelware factory and to exploit essentially newly enforced slave labour whilst all the Jews are sort of ghettoised within their own community. I suppose the kind of heart of the story, or the emotional heart of the story, is this gradual, well, this is a point of contention with me and you, James, but to me, this sort of gradual overcoming of Schindler's sort of entrepreneurial and capitalist instincts into making his factory into a haven for what became known as the Schindler Jews, because by about the middle or 3/4 of the book, the options for these Jews are essentially either go to a concentration camp and very likely die, or go to Schindler's enamelware factory, where you will be fed, you won't be beaten, you will still essentially be a slave, but your life is secure. The other thing about the book, I suppose, is that it does sort of function at the same time as a kind of history book or a documentary, in the sense there are a lot of cutaways to individual characters or families, Polish families, within the novel who suffered under Hitler's regime. I should probably say from the top that these characters are so numerous and their stories are so sort of nuanced and multifaceted that we probably likely will not have time to go into them in very great detail. We may pull out one or two, but the book is essentially a kind of almost documentary style account of the Second World War in Poland and of the Holocaust in Krakow centrally, told partially through the eyes of Oskar Schindler.
Yeah, no, he says on page 1 of this book, I have attempted to avoid all fiction, since fiction would debase the record. Now, I was around in 1982, and that was a book of controversy. Like most book of controversies, even more than most, actually, this one manufactured, I thought. But the question was this actually a non-fiction book? And if so, should it have won the best novel of the year? You're right. It feels like a novel, doesn't it? It's got the texture of a novel.
I think there are certain things that really give it away as a novel. Although in the afterword in my edition, Keneally does write that he decided from the top that the tone of the novel would be adjacent to Truman Capote's In Cold Blood.
Oh,
so I
yeah.
suppose
Which was described as a non-fiction novel, isn't it?
Yes. So I suppose your feelings about Capote might, your feelings about In Cold Blood would dictate your feelings about whether or not Schindler's Ark is a novel.
Yeah. And also, who cares, basically? I think we should factor in. But let's get into this bone of contention between us then. Let's not mess about. I would maintain that in the film, Schindler's List, which we'll be doing in part 2, there is an absolute, there is your actual Hollywood narrative arc. Schindler goes on a journey. His eyes are slowly open to what's happening to the Jews, and he turns from a sort of villainous entrepreneur into a savior, really.
Yes.
But I think in the book, that's less true, I suppose. So we first meet him, actually, unlike the film, it starts off halfway through before we flash back. So it starts in August 1943 when he's he's hobnobbing with various Nazis. But we already know he's not like them. For a start, he's nice to the Jewish servant girl who's being badly mistreated by the commandant. Eamon Gert is a double-dyed villain. Yeah. We then flash back to his early childhood in Czechoslovakia, in German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, where he's friends with Jewish children. He then meets Isaac Stern, who's going to help him buy the factory and run the factory. He's an accountant who was involved in the old factory, I think. And straight away, Stern senses what he calls a just goy, obviously Jewish word for Gentile, And he's right. We sense a just Goy too. Again and again, Keneally keeps saying that he's an incredibly ambiguous figure and morally ambiguous. But even then, let me just give you a couple of examples. So one of the flaws he gives him is that he's womanizing. But then he says that there's this to be said for him, that to all his women, he was a well-mannered and generous lover. And then he talks about his drinking. Like few others, he was capable of staying canny when drinking. He never got hangovers. He chain smokes, but it was a composed chain smoking. There was never tension in his hand. He was stylish. Right from the start, and both Keneally and us think, on the whole, what a guy. Or if you want it to be hilarious, what a goy. But you think there's more of an arc in and I think in the film, that arc you're talking about is much clearer than in the book, where he's basically a decent and not all that ambiguous figure all the way through.
Actually, I think that that's not the right equivocation in a way. I think definitely in the film, and we'll come on to that in part 2, that there is way more of an arc of sort of
a journey,
that essentially begins after Schindler witnesses a kind of massacre on the streets of Krakow that leads to the installation of the Płaszów camp, and from that point in the film, you see these sort of hesitant steps forwards to him thinking, should I save this person? Should I not? We'll come on to that. In the book, I think by page 150, we are quite clear that it's Oscar's explicit intent to save as many people as he can. Yeah. And whereas that is not clear in the film. But I think the thing that makes him so ambiguous in the novel is the means by which he is able to save these people. There is a line when Amon Goethe is introduced.
He's the commandant, yeah.
Yes, he is the person who runs the Płaszów camp. There is a line from Keneally that Amon is essentially Oscar's dark brother, that they have a sort of similar upbringing and similar appetites. They've got appetites for money, appetites for women, appetites for a certain kind of power over people. The difference is how they choose to exercise those appetites. Yeah. But I think the ambiguity in Schindler's character is sort of in the fact that he is still reaching into these darker parts of himself in order to con a system. And the word con, I don't think he's ever explicitly referred to as a con man, but the idea of him conning people is constantly referred to. Of course, we think of this in a very good way because he's conning Nazis out of killing Jews. But there's a kind of coldness to him and a kind of emotional remove that he needs to access in order to achieve that. And I think for me, it's so clear in several passages. You know that he's doing this for good reasons, this justification, because he wants to save people. But the justification is just so cruel. It's the fact that he speaks Goethe's language, or in this case, a SS officer called Toffel. He's trying to prevent Nazi intervention in his enamelware factory. And this exchange goes, as a result of such conversations, Oskar became an advocate of the principle that a factory owner should have unimpeded access to his own workers, that these workers should have access to the plant, that they should not be detained or tyrannized on their way to and from the factory. It was, in Oskar's eyes, a moral axiom as much as an industrial one. In the end, he would apply it to its limit at Deutsche Emelfabrik. So this idea that he has to have this kind of moral sense of himself working at the same time as the kind of capitalist, industrialist sense, to me makes him... He's very obviously a person working on the side of the good, but a person who is exercising certain base instincts in order to work on the side of the good. And actually the part of the book that I loved the most, it's such a small detail that enables him to do this, is for a lot of the book he has an affair with his secretary Wiktoria Klonowska, and there's a point where he has 3 lovers, his wife and 2 other women. He buys Klonowska which is a far more extravagant gift than the ones he gets for his wife or his other
Always a bit
lover.
bit love, actually.
Yeah. So he buys Klonowska this poodle, and he's been bedding her, and she likes him very much. And, but then at a certain point on one of his birthdays, he gets arrested. I think at that point for kissing a Jewish girl on the factory floor. So he gets put in jail, and at that point treated fairly well by SS officers, although subsequent arrests are a bit shakier. But he says to Klonowska, "You will have to cancel certain appointments of mine," and he gives her a list of names to reach out to get him out of prison. And she does so, and this is sort of like her first truly big task, is to get Oskar Schindler out of jail without any kind of suspicion that he may be saving Jews. And when he comes out of jail, he gets into a car where Klonowska is waiting for him. And the poodle is right next to her. And to me, this poodle is such a great image, because you think, for all the, I'm sure very wonderful sex that they might have been having, that she's not in love with him. The reason that she has been so happy to work for him, as with many of German agents in the book, is because he can provide this kind of largesse, this poodle, these cigarettes, that silk shirt, that enamelware. I don't doubt that he is a man working for a good cause. What's ambiguous to me is the extent to which his own personal morality is what drives that versus his love of money and ability to run a business.
No, but in the end, he gives up. He basically spends,
he goes bankrupt.
Yeah,
by
he
the
goes
end,
bankrupt saving Jews.
Yeah.
I'll give you, there's a ambiguity to his methods.
Well, I think the listener can make up their minds.
They really can. Now, Joe, there's what I've sort of nicknamed in my literary pretentious way the Oliver Twist problem with Schindler's Ark, or the possible Oliver Twist problem.
You're going to have to tell me what that means.
I will tell you what that means. So Oliver Twist shows the unbelievable systematic institutional injustice of the workhouse system and treatment of boys like Oliver. And then basically it's all right in the end because one guy is nice to Oliver, who turns out to be middle class. so it's okay after all. But leaving that last point aside, so one person is saved, and that means the book has a happy ending.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you've got this problem with Schindler's Ark and in Schindler's List, and I think both Keneally and Spielberg face up to it and discuss it. But it's there all the same, isn't it? One of the phrases that runs through the book is from the Talmud, which Stern says to Schindler, "He who saves one man saves the entire world."
Yeah.
Now, A, that's clearly not true. I don't want to be harsh, but B,
argue with Talmudic verse on this podcast, James will get cancelled.
No, but B, the whole of the book demonstrates that that's not true, because it doesn't save the world. There are all those scenes, like, for example, where he wants to get one of his guys off the train.
Well, in the book, it's like 12 people.
Yeah, okay. Every now and then, but there's one where he wants to get. In the film, it's Stern, but in the book, it's Bankier, his office manager. So he realizes he's been put on one of the trains going to Auschwitz, and he goes running along, and he gets him off the train. Then the train pulls off with thousands of people going to their deaths.
Yes.
This is acknowledged by Keneally. It says, "It was fortunate for Abraham," that's Bankier, "that Oskar did not ask himself why it was Bankier's name he called, that he did not pause and consider that Bankier's had only equal value to all the other names loaded aboard the rolling stock. An existentialist might have been defeated by the numbers, stunned by the equal appeal of all names and voices. Herr Schindler was a philosophic innocent. He knew the people he knew."
There were, I think, 2, maybe 3 bits in the novel that were deeply, deeply interesting to me that I think feed into your so-called Oliver Twist problem, where Oskar is essentially, he has need of comfort from people who are in much more dire situations than he is. So my favourite one, because it's probably as close to comedy as this book comes, is a moment just after halfway in, when the assassination attempt on Hitler's life has occurred, and everyone is waiting by the radio to see whether he's alive, to see whether the Fuhrer will make any kind of speech that will prove he's alive. And Oskar whips himself up into a frenzy, believing that Hitler must be dead. It's been hours since we've heard any kind of confirmation that he's alive. They must be attempting to conceal the fact that he was successfully murdered. And in the end, of course, Hitler's voice does come on the radio. And there's this really, really interesting passage as he's doing this with a man called Adam Gard, who is a Schindler Jew. But Oskar had been believing in the death with a feverish conviction for hours now, and when it turned out to be an illusion, it was young Gard who found himself cast as the comforter, while Oskar spoke with an almost operatic grief. All our vision of deliverance is futile, he said. He poured another glass of cognac each, then pushed the bottle across the desk, opening his cigarette box. Take the cognac and some cigarettes and get some sleep. We'll have to wait a little longer for our freedom. In the confusion of the cognac, of the news and of its sudden reversal in the small hours, Gard did not think it strange that Oskar was talking about our freedom, as if they had an equivalent need, were both prisoners who had to wait passively to be liberated. So it's like this recurring thing sometimes. There's another point earlier in the book where Stern has to comfort Oskar because he doesn't want him to be so demoralized that he stops running the factory. That Oskar, sort of by today's standards, millionaire, free man, at his leisure, has to be comforted by an enslaved and downtrodden person. I think it's an interesting conundrum that Keneally deals with in the book's form, that although the thing that makes this story interesting is a Nazi official, a free man, to whatever extent morally ambiguous man, there's this bigger picture of people who are actually suffering, and where do you place the weight? I guess the emotional weight.
I read that completely different. I read that passage as proof of just, again, how great Schindler is, that he is as much trapped as the Jews. But you're right, he's not.
Yeah. Yeah, quite clearly.
But the fact that he feels that he is. So you've got, right at the end, there's big set piece speech, which is, again, slightly different from in the film, when the factory is about to close because the Russians are approaching and they're about to be liberated. This is when the factory has been moved. And he makes a speech in which he tells the SS guards who are still there, although he's sort of kept them at arm's length from his factory, that you're as much imprisoned as the Jews are. And I think we're meant to think that's really great, aren't we? But you think, actually, no, they're not. Okay, no, that's interesting.
Yeah, but I think this is sort of like as much a conundrum for Keneally as a writer in shaping this novel in order to sustain the reader's interest, as it is a kind of crucial to the plot kind of conundrum.
Okay, maybe here's the kind of synthesis. Right at the end, he saves 30 tinsmiths, and Keneally says they were merely a fragment of the 10,000, and because of that, it must be said again that Oskar was only a minor god of rescue. But still the word god, but a minor god of rescue. And maybe we'll get on to another thing that the book, I think, certainly achieves. We're not going to disagree on this, even us, Joe, which is it works to restore, in a way, the unimaginability of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So all the way through, every terrible thing that happens, the Jews kind of think, well, it's not going to get any worse than this. Okay, this is it. Right at the start, they're quite convinced that they'll always need us because 1 in 11 Poles are Jewish. Then a lot of them are moved out of Krakow, and they say to each other, we'll do this, and that will be the brunt of what they ask. Then the ghetto's set up, which is terrible enough. And they say, we'll be inside. They'll say, one person says, we'll be inside. The enemy will be inside. We can run our own affairs. No one will envy us. No one will stone us in the streets. The walls of the ghetto will be fixed. The walls will be final, fixed form of the catastrophe. To Plaszow, so then the ghetto's liquidized. They move to Plaszow. At least we've got work. We're in a camp now. And yet it's all building up to the thing that nobody can imagine. And in fact, when the first reports, someone has found out what's happening further east in Auschwitz, and comes back and explains, and they say what's happening, and then Keneally breaks off to say, to write these things now is to state the commonplaces of history, but to find them out in 1942, to have them break upon you from a June sky, was to suffer a fundamental shock, a derangement in that area of the brain in which stable ideas about humankind and its possibilities are kept. And I think is very good on that, and also the politics of that, actually, because one thing, the many good things Schindler does, he occasionally goes to Budapest and Istanbul to report to Zionists what's going on in Europe, or what's going on in Poland. And essentially, again, they won't believe him. It cannot be imagined that this is going to happen. And we know from other reports that actually that was one of the great I mean, it's a hideous thing to say, but one of the great sort of clever tricks of Auschwitz is when people are arriving on trains, it's unimaginable that they were just going to be sent into gas chambers.
Mm.
And that made it possible to do. Sorry, I know that we like to keep it light on this podcast, Joe, but I suppose I haven't left you much to make of that, though.
I'm stalling because I'm on the verge of tears, actually.
But that restoration of the unimaginability of it all, I think, is is absolutely brilliantly done in the book.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that before we segue into our conversation about the film is the specific way in which it's achieved. And I think the paragraph you read about the unimaginability of this at the time versus, you know, the fact that it's commonplace now to believe is that Keneally on a sentence level is so deft with how he positions his readers. It happens on page 1 in like the third paragraph of the book. In fact, you become aware that that actually you're part of the novel as reader. So the book opens on this scene of Schindler exiting a car in 1943 onto icy ground, and his chauffeur cracks a joke with him. And then sort of in the middle of that, Keneally says, in observing this small winter scene, we are on safe ground. And with that, he kind of signals to you that there is a particular mode of attention that you have to sustain throughout this book. Yes, you are on the one hand reading a novel, but it's very much based in fact and based in a lot of modes of supposition or assumption that you may already have about the Second World War or about the Holocaust itself. And so every so often he's very careful to kind of lift you out of the text with a few sentences in this very sort of documentary-like nature, refer to the audience as we, include himself in that, and kind of adjust your focus in a way that reminds you, you know, yes, you may have learnt about this in school. Yes, you know, this is probably something that you've had in the background of your education or general cultural historical knowledge. But here I am giving it to you again in this particular way.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot that we can pick up on. Stay with us. We'll be back in part 2.
Okay, welcome back to part 2, where, as promised, we're moving on from Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally to Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg's film, in our Booker at the Oscars series, episode 1. Just a little bit of background to the film is that Spielberg was sent a review of the novel when it came out, actually, and then the novel itself by the head of MCA Entertainment, who later became head of Universal, which made the film in the end. But this was 1982, and he didn't feel ready to make the film at that point. I think he just felt he was too young for such a massive story. It was only 10 years later when Universal, he had another go with Universal. And one of the sort of odder things in film history, really, is that the studio agreed to fund Schindler's List on condition that he made Jurassic Park first that same year. So he was given 3 times the budget. He was given $22 million for Schindler's List, but first $66 million to make Jurassic Park, which had to be made first. So in fact, that ended up with, must have been one of the oddest experiences in the history of filmmaking. Old Spielberg over in Europe filming Schindler's List by day and editing Jurassic Park by night. Quite an achievement in filmic terms. And it starred, starring as Oskar Schindler himself, was the then comparatively unknown Liam Neeson, with Ralph Fiennes as Eamon Gert, the villainous commandant, and completing a pleasing trio of Brits, Joe, come on. Ben Kingsley as Isaac Stern, who's Schindler's main sidekick in the factory. And as well as
sidekick is a bit of an odd choice.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yes.
Right-hand man, maybe.
Yeah, okay, yes, okay, yes. No, fair point. Well point. Yeah, okay. Sidekick. Okay, yes. Right-hand man, comrade.
Slave.
And bloke who does all the work as well, as acknowledged. While Schindler sort of hands out the brandy and fags. But anyway, so it won a lot of Oscars, as we mentioned. Best Picture, Best Director for Spielberg, Best Adapted Screenplay for Steven Zalian, though none for the actors. In 2008, the American Film Institute named it the 8th best American film of all time. that being back in the days when Citizen Kane was always at number one. And the film led directly to the establishment also of the Shoah Foundation by Spielberg himself to educate people about Holocaust and other genocides, mainly through the testimony of survivors. But, Joe, the acclaim hasn't been entirely universal. Claude Lanzmann, who made the epic and highly influential 9-hour documentary Shoah, which some people might have seen, called it kitschy melodrama. I think it was Stanley Kubrick. You think it was someone else who said that, think that's about the Holocaust? That was about success, wasn't it? The Holocaust is about 6 million people who get killed. Schindler's List is about 600 who don't, which is the wrong number, actually. It's 1,100 who don't, but I suppose
I think it's just pithier, isn't it?
does return us to the Oliver Twist problem, I suppose. So where do you stand on that, Joe, on the film?
See, I have very mixed feelings about the film. The ways in which Spielberg translates elements of Keneally's novel successfully kind of make it a weaker film. And the ways in which Spielberg sort of goes off and does his own thing, even though allegedly he spent the entire shoot insisting that it wasn't going to be a Spielbergian film, that he wasn't going to rely on his so-called bag of tricks, is where it actually sort of succeeds more for me. I will say to anyone who hasn't seen Schindler's List and wants to by the end of listening to this episode, it would be unfair of us not to warn you that it's an extremely brutal, graphic, horrific film. I think in a way it's sort of more successful than Keneally's book because the slaughter in it is so graphic. But then that sort of documentary style that we were talking about towards the end of part one, of Keneally sort of plucking the reader out above the text and refocusing the way in which they read, was sort of the film's downfall for me. I thought of the film in two ways. This may be a bit odd, but to me, there was the kind of documentary style, and then there were intimate moments.
We probably should say people, because I should have said it at the beginning of this bit and I forgot. It's in black and white.
Yes, it is.
Which the studio had big reservations about, but Spielberg insisted on.
No, I think the black and white works.
Yeah.
In fact, the very famous instance of colour, which we will talk about, The Girl in the Red Coat, to me feels kitschy and feels Hollywood. That doesn't work for me. But I think the kind of shots where Spielberg is essentially taking these vast passages that Keneally invests so much time and care into of individual stories within the camp, and he kind of plonks them into the film. They tend to happen as a sort of wide shot, and they tend to involve some form of, someone's being shot in the back of the head, prisoners are being made to run around the camps are being built, people are shoveling snow, or, a truckload of children is being driven out to Auschwitz. There's no doubt that the things these scenes are depicting are horrific, but that kind of documentary style distance, I would expect to cry at a film like Schindler's List, but it just felt so sort of dry to me. It's not that I wanted to cry, or the success of it sort of made me, or that, I thought it would only be successful if I cried. But there was just this very kind of, sounds awful to say, dead, and not in a kind of, I've numbed I feel numb in response to this, just kind of dead, like, I wonder what the next scene is going to be kind of feeling when these moments occur. But I will say my feelings are mixed, because I think what Spielberg does really well is sometimes he will give you these incredibly intimate moments where I think the brutality of what happens in Pashov it hits way harder. So for me, a really good example of this is when Ray Fiennes as Amon Goethe is talking to his maid Helen Hirsch, and he's having this very one-sided conversation with her where she is utterly silent because she doesn't know what, if she says one word, it might be the word that kills her.
I would like so much to reach out and touch you in your loneliness.
What would that be like? I wonder. I mean, what would be wrong with that? And I realize that you're not a person in the strictest sense of the word, but I mean, well, maybe you're right about that too. You know, maybe what's wrong it's not us. It's it's this. I mean, when they compare you to vermin and to rodents and to lice, I just no, you make a good point. You make a very good point. Is this the face of a rat? Are these the eyes of a rat? Hath not a Jew eyes? No, I don't think so. You're a Jewish bitch. You nearly talked me into it, didn't you?
So Ray Fiennes is just circling her
Yeah,
around this. I
yeah.
think it's a basement or an attic.
Yeah,
I can't remember
basement, I
which.
think, yeah.
He's just circling her as the man who is imprisoning her, talking this delusional nonsense about how perhaps he might love her. He's very fond of her. If she ever needs a reference after the war, he's more than happy to give one.
Yeah.
Helen is a good person. And then without her uttering a word, it turns and he goes, oh, no, you're a Jew, you're a bitch, excuse my language, and ends up beating her. But the beating isn't the horrific part of that scene. To me, the horrific part of that scene are these really close shots of Helen Hirsch and Amonga's character and the kind of tension that's building because you know that he's going to hurt her. Similarly, there's a scene where certain camp members are being taken like cattle to I think to Auschwitz, and they're discussing the possibility that they might be gassed. But the way it's shot is like a sleepover. That they're kind of like on their leaning forward on their elbows, exchanging rumors, like swapping rumors, like they're kind of at a party going, well, I heard this, someone told me this, I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. It's like gossip. And it's so horrifying because they're being sent to their death, but here they are sort of doing in this kind of pose that you must have had as a child whenever you went to your friend's house. And for me, that's where the film works for me, not in these kind of like big displays of violence.
Wow. Well, really, for me, it's both. I mean, those two scenes you mentioned are fantastic, particularly the one with Gerd and Helen. Well, Girl in Red I might give you, by the way, but we can come on to that.
Well, see, Girl in Red for me is, I know this is actually something that comes directly from the book, because in the book, Schindler does see this girl in a scarlet hat and a scarlet coat, and she's quite a pivotal kind of moment at which he realizes the full extent, the full horror of what's happening, and it's the same in the film. But I think there's just something so sort of in an entirely black and white film. I think the only other color in the film comes at the very end with a scene of the actual survivors laying stones on Schindler's grave, and also from two candles at the beginning and end. But this Girl in Red, for some reason, to me, it's just sort of visually, like in the book it works, but visually, with greatest respects to Steven Spielberg, it feels like such a cheap ploy. It's like your eye needs to go here and your sympathies need to go here, as if a load of other people around her weren't being killed.
But Spielberg has said in interviews that the Girl in Red is meant to, in a way, signify the sort of red flag of the Allies could have known that it was clear to see what was going on, and there should have been bombing of the tracks to Auschwitz and so on. And so she represents the red flag that the Allies should have seen. I must admit, you don't get it in the film at all. No, I think what you do get is that slightly kitschy bit. I'm not very keen on the bit right at the end of the film where he breaks down as well about.
I was about to ask you about that. So for listeners who don't know, this does not happen in the book, but at the end of the film, it sort of follows the book. There is a speech where, Oskar tells everyone that sort of the Reich has fallen, Hitler is dead, the Allies have won. And then this moment where he comes out of the factory and he promises to stay with the Schindler Jews 5 minutes past midnight before he makes his escape. And in the book, this is a very sort of calm sequence in which Schindler, I suppose, the significance in the book is that it represents this sort of reversal where after, these years in which the people in his care have depended on his largesse and his money for the rest of his life, he will be dependent on their care and their money because he will essentially be penniless after 1950. In the film, what happens is that sort of Schindler comes out, he's given a ring in Talmudic verse as he is in the book, but then he has this kind of complete breakdown.
This car. Kurt would have bought this car. Why did I keep the car? 10 people right there. 10 people. 10 more people. This pin. 2 people. This is gold. 2 more people. He would have given me 2 for it. At least 1. He would have given me 1. 1 more. 1 more person. The person is there. For this. I could have got 1 more person. And I didn't. I didn't.
And to be fair to Liam Neeson, Liam Neeson's a great actor. It's affecting, it works. But I think that my problem with the film generally is reflected in that scene, because in the film, it's a 3-hour-long movie. And I feel like up until 2 hours and 15 minutes in, Schindler is pretty much like a grey area, if not a bad guy. And then all of a sudden there's this flip to me. It's way too sudden in the film. So after 45 minutes of him suddenly euphorically being like a good man, to then have him kind of break down, it's too much.
He is a bit post-Ghost Scrooge, isn't he? That's a bit harsh. I know what you mean. I've been going on about the character arc in the film rather than the book, and it's true that it really accelerates. But he does get better and better in the book too, but not quite to the same extent in the film where he becomes pretty much full on.
Yeah.
Full on totally. But that breakdown at the end about I could have saved more. That's Spielberg's answer, I think, to what we've been calling the Oliver Twist problem. He wanted to remind people of all the people who didn't remind viewers of all the people who didn't make it out.
James, it's a one-word answer, book or film?
It's so not a one-word answer, Joe. There used to be a theory.
God's sake,
James.
James.
That he is. There used to be a theory that there's no great book that became a great film. It's not entirely true, this, but on the whole, great films are made of rubbish books, and great books become rubbish films. Plenty of exceptions. And one of the exceptions, I think, is this. I think it's a great book and a great film. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to sit on the fence there.
That's rubbish.
Okay, then, go on. You make it. You go for it, then.
Book.
Okay. Oh, you did.
That's
one
all
word.
it took, James.
And that's it for our first The Booker at the Oscars episode on Schindler's Ark and List. To find out more about Thomas Keneally's novel, head to thebookerprizes.com, and also you can check the show notes for a handy article which details every single Booker Prize book that's been adapted into any film or TV series ever.
You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok and Substack at The Booker Prizes, and join our book group on Facebook.
We'll be back next week with a regular episode, but do look out soon for another The Booker at the Oscars, this time about The English Patient.
Till next time, bye.
Bye.
The Booker Prize podcast is hosted by me, Jo Hamier, and by James Walton. It is produced and edited by Kevin Moyolo, and the executive producer is John Davenport. It is a Daddy's Super Yacht production for the Booker Prizes.